The town of Maplewood had always prided itself on being the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked and waved to each other on their way to work. It was a community tucked away from the noise of the nearest city, filled with tidy lawns, kids riding bikes after school, and weekend barbecues. The kind of town where people thought nothing truly bad could happen. That illusion shattered on a chilly Thursday morning when news spread that Sarah Henderson, a 32-year-old mother of one, had vanished without a trace. The first signs of trouble appeared early, before most residents had even poured their first cup of coffee. Sarah's sister, who lived 2 towns over, had called her multiple times that morning and received no response. At first, she brushed it off as unusual, but not alarming. Sarah was a devoted mother, busy with her toddler, Emily, and sometimes slow to return calls. But when the hours stretched on and Sarah still hadn't answered, the concern grew into dread. Her husband, Michael, finally reported her missing just after noon, saying he had woken up to find the bed empty, Sarah's purse still on the nightstand, and her phone sitting on the dresser. When police arrived, the house didn't look like a crime scene. There were no broken windows, no signs of forced entry, nothing overturned or stolen. Sarah's car was still parked neatly in the driveway. The coffee pot on the kitchen counter was empty, suggesting she had started her morning routine, but her keys were left behind on the counter. It was the kind of scenario that immediately set off alarms for detectives. A woman who seemed to have vanished into thin air, leaving behind the essential items no one abandons voluntarily. Neighbors gathered in clusters on the sidewalk, whispering anxiously as officers went in and out of the Henderson home. Mrs. Caldwell from across the street, who often babysat Emily, clutched her sweater tightly as she spoke to a reporter. "She's not the type to just leave," she insisted. "Sarah loved that little girl more than anything. If she's gone, then something's wrong. Very wrong." Inside the house, investigators moved methodically. Detective Ramirez, a seasoned officer with 15 years of experience, took note of every detail. He lingered by the living room window, studying the neatly arranged furniture, the lack of disturbance. To him, it didn't look like a random abduction. Whoever had taken Sarah or harmed her likely knew her. Still, in those early hours, no one had enough information to form conclusions. Michael Henderson was cooperative, at least on the surface. He answered questions in a calm, almost mechanical tone, describing the previous night as ordinary. "We had dinner, watched a little TV, and went to bed," he said. "When I woke up this morning, she wasn't there." He explained that he thought she might have gone for a walk, though Sarah's sister quickly contradicted that, telling police Sarah never went anywhere without her phone, especially not leaving Emily alone in the house. Emily, just shy of 3 years old, was in the care of a neighbor while investigators worked inside. She toddled about, giggling and tugging at the hem of Mrs. Caldwell's skirt, blissfully unaware of the storm building around her. No one considered her capable of contributing to the search. She was a baby, after all, her words often garbled, her sentences half-formed. The adults focused on adult matters: alibis, evidence, timelines. As the day wore on, the search widened. Officers canvassed the neighborhood, knocking on doors, asking if anyone had seen or heard unusual activity during the night. A few neighbors reported hearing a car start around midnight, but in a town where people came and went at odd hours, nothing seemed out of place. Others said they'd seen Sarah the day before, walking Emily in a stroller, cheerful as ever. Nobody could recall anything alarming. The local news picked up the story by evening. A reporter stood at the end of the Henderson driveway, microphone in hand, relaying the facts to the camera. Behind her, yellow police tape fluttered in the breeze, a stark contrast to the manicured hedges and children's toys scattered across the lawn. Viewers at home watched in disbelief. A mother gone missing from her own home in a neighborhood that felt almost untouched by crime. That night, a sense of unease blanketed Maplewood. Families locked their doors earlier than usual. Parents kept their children close, even in backyards. Rumors spread quickly through text messages and social media. Some speculated Sarah had been kidnapped. Others whispered about domestic disputes. A few wondered if she had simply run away. The truth, however, remained buried, and the uncertainty gnawed at everyone. Detective Ramirez stayed late at the Henderson house, reviewing his notes. He found himself staring at the framed photographs on the mantel. Sarah smiling at a family picnic. Sarah cradling a newborn Emily in her arms. The three of them posed at Christmas in matching sweaters. To the outside world, they looked like the perfect family. But he knew appearances could be deceiving. His gut told him the answer to Sarah's disappearance was closer than anyone wanted to admit. Michael, meanwhile, continued to insist he had no idea what had happened. His composure struck some officers as odd, too even, too rehearsed, but there was no evidence yet to challenge his story. He agreed to let detectives search the home, his voice steady as he answered each question. If he was hiding something, he concealed it well. And through it all, Emily played quietly. She sat on the floor of the living room, stacking colorful blocks into precarious towers, humming to herself. Occasionally, she babbled words only she understood, pointing toward the garage or holding up a toy car. Nobody paid her much attention. The detectives had bigger concerns, and the family's toddler was considered nothing more than an innocent bystander in the tragedy unfolding around her. Yet in that overlooked innocence, in the small fragments of words and gestures, lay the very truth they were searching for. A truth that would take days to recognize, and when it finally surfaced, it would change the course of the investigation forever. For now, though, Maplewood was left in suspense. A mother had disappeared, a family was fractured, and a town that once believed itself safe was suddenly staring into the abyss of uncertainty. As the first day of the search ended, no one, not the police, not the neighbors, not even Michael Henderson himself, suspected that the case's turning point would come not from high-tech forensics, not from surveillance footage or eyewitnesses, but from the soft, unassuming voice of a child too young to understand the weight of her own words. The following morning, Maplewood no longer felt like Maplewood. Overnight, the Henderson case had transformed the quiet suburb into the epicenter of a mystery. Police cruisers lined the street, yellow tape fluttered across the yard, and curious neighbors lingered on porches, whispering theories over steaming mugs of coffee. The small town sense of safety had evaporated, replaced with an uneasy silence, broken only by the low hum of police radios and the shuffle of investigators moving door to door. Detective Ramirez arrived early. He was greeted by a wall of flashing cameras from local news stations that had set up camp near the cul-de-sac. Reporters called out questions. Any leads? Do you suspect foul play? But Ramirez ignored them. He wasn't ready to feed speculation. Inside, the command post buzzed with activity. Maps of the neighborhood were pinned to a board, and an evidence table had been established in the Henderson living room. The house itself had become both a crime scene and an open wound for the community. The search began methodically. Officers split into teams. Some combed through wooded trails at the edge of town. Others canvassed local businesses for surveillance footage. Flyers bearing Sarah's smiling face were distributed at gas stations, diners, and grocery stores. Volunteers, moved by a mixture of fear and compassion, gathered to join search parties. Parents with teenagers, retirees, even local college students, all armed with flashlights, gloves, and determination, walked shoulder to shoulder through fields, creeks, and abandoned barns. Despite the turnout, the first day yielded nothing. No shoe prints, no discarded belongings, no trace of Sarah. The lack of physical evidence only deepened the mystery. Back at the Henderson house, Michael repeated his story to investigators. He sat stiffly at the dining table, hands folded in front of him, answering each question without hesitation. "We went to bed around 11, he said. "I woke up around 7, and she wasn't there. I thought maybe she went for a walk, or to see a friend." His voice was flat, almost clinical. Detectives noted his composure. Some interpreted it as shock, others as indifference. His account was consistent, but something about his demeanor unsettled Ramirez. "Most husbands in this situation are frantic," Ramirez later remarked to a colleague. "He seems calculated." Still, calculated wasn't a crime, and without evidence, suspicion remained just that, suspicion. As investigators dug deeper, Sarah's character became central to the narrative. Friends and coworkers described her as reliable, nurturing, and deeply committed to her daughter. "She lived for Emily," said her best friend Rachel. "She would never, ever leave her behind. Not for a night, not for a minute." That fact alone undermined the theory that Sarah had left voluntarily. Every missing person case started with the question, did they leave by choice, or were they taken? In Sarah's case, everyone agreed she wouldn't have left her child. The pressure mounted. Each hour that passed without answers made the likelihood of a safe return slimmer. The FBI offered assistance, supplying specialized teams to help with searches and digital analysis. Detectives combed through Sarah's phone records, but they revealed nothing unusual. No mysterious calls, no late-night messages, no sign of a secret life. Social media showed snapshots of a devoted mother, photos at playgrounds, birthday cakes, holiday decorations. On the surface, Sarah's life was ordinary. Too ordinary to vanish without a trace. Meanwhile, the community began to fracture under the weight of suspicion. Maplewood was small enough that everyone knew everyone, and whispers grew louder each day. At the local diner, patrons speculated openly. "It's always the husband," one man muttered. Others defended Michael, pointing out his calm cooperation. A few suggested the possibility of an outsider, a stranger who had slipped into their quiet neighborhood under cover of darkness. Each theory only fueled the sense of unease. One evening, volunteers gathered at the local church to organize the next day's search. Candles flickered on the altar as Sarah's photograph was displayed at the front of the room. Her sister spoke through tears, begging for anyone with information to come forward. The room was heavy with sorrow and determination. People wanted answers, but more than that, they wanted their peace of mind back. Through it all, little Emily remained a silent observer. Neighbors took turns watching her, shielding her from the chaos as best they could. She was too young to understand why her mother wasn't home, why her house was filled with strangers in uniforms, why her father spent so much time talking to men with notebooks. She played quietly with her toys, sometimes babbling words that made adults smile absent-mindedly, unaware that her tiny voice carried pieces of the truth. By the end of the first week, the case felt stuck. Investigators had exhausted the obvious leads, and the trail was growing colder by the hour. Ramirez stood in the Henderson garage one night, staring at Michael's red sedan. It had already been searched, standard procedure, but something gnawed at him. He crouched near the bumper, running his hand across the surface as if expecting the car itself to reveal a secret. Nothing stood out, yet the feeling persisted. That same evening, as Michael spoke to detectives in the living room, Emily toddled in carrying a toy car. She pointed toward the garage and muttered, "Red car, red car." The words barely registered with anyone at the time. An officer smiled faintly and patted her head, dismissing it as the kind of random chatter toddlers often produce. Ramirez, however, paused. He scribbled the phrase in his notebook, unsure why. Perhaps it was instinct, or perhaps he'd been in the field long enough to know that truth sometimes emerges in the most unexpected ways. For now, though, the remark faded into the background. Investigators continued chasing conventional leads, calling in tips, reviewing hours of footage from local gas stations and traffic cameras. Each lead fizzled. Each day ended in frustration. The weight of failure hung over the task force like a storm cloud. And yet, the smallest voice in the case had already spoken. Nobody realized it, but the clue that would eventually unravel everything had already been uttered in the simplest of terms. Red car. 2 words. Spoken by a toddler, brushed aside in the noise of adult speculation. The search pressed on, but the answers lay much closer than anyone could have imagined. The Henderson home had become a revolving door of investigators, neighbors, and reporters. Each day seemed to bring a new round of questions, yet none of them brought answers. As adults leaned over maps and pored over reports, one small figure drifted almost invisibly through the chaos. Emily Henderson, 2 years and 9 months old, clutching her stuffed bear and trailing from room to room with the unsteady steps of a toddler. Most saw her presence as little more than a complication, another burden for neighbors or relatives to manage, while her father spoke with detectives. Yet Emily had been there that night. She had been in the house. Though her words were few and often jumbled, she was the only living witness who had seen her mother for the last time. Detectives, however, did not view her that way. "She's too young to understand," one officer remarked. Even if she saw something, she wouldn't know how to explain it. Investigators preferred measurable evidence, fingerprints, DNA, timelines. Emily, with her giggles and babble, did not fit into that framework. But children notice things adults overlook. At first, Emily was quiet, content to sit in her playpen or wander with blocks in her hands while strangers in uniforms filled her house. She watched the flashing lights outside, the notebooks, the serious faces. Her father, always the calm figure in her life, seemed busier than usual, answering endless questions. Sometimes she toddled toward him, tugging on his sleeve, but he would gently redirect her to the neighbor watching her. Yet when detectives gathered near the garage one afternoon, Emily's behavior shifted. She toddled over, pointed toward the closed door, and muttered something under her breath. "Ka, ka," she said, her tiny finger jabbing at the door. None of the officers paid much attention. One smiled politely and crouched down, asking, "You like cars, sweetie?" before returning to his notebook. Emily frowned, then sat on the floor with her toy truck, driving it in circles. Later, when Ramirez returned to his car, he found himself thinking about her gesture. It meant nothing. Probably toddlers obsessed over vehicles all the time. Still, something about the way she had pointed so intently stuck with him. Ramirez jotted it down in his notebook. Child pointed at garage. Repeated car. It wasn't evidence. It wasn't testimony. But it was something. Meanwhile, the investigation pressed forward. Detectives interviewed Sarah's coworkers, friends, even distant acquaintances. They combed through bank records, emails, texts. Each line of inquiry fizzled. Nothing suggested she had planned to leave. Nothing pointed to an outside abductor. Suspicion kept circling back to the house, back to Michael, but without physical evidence, the case teetered on stalemate. And Emily kept talking. When placed in her crib at night, she sometimes whispered fragments of sentences, the way toddlers mimic adults they overhear. "Mama, car. She muttered one night as the neighbor tucked her in. The woman paused, her heart tightening. Was Emily recalling something? Or was it just the randomness of a child's imagination? The neighbor mentioned it casually to an officer the next day, who scribbled a note but did not pursue it further. Children said all sorts of things. They weren't considered reliable witnesses. Yet Emily's fixation on the garage grew. She toddled past investigators, tugged at their pant legs, and repeated the same sounds. Ka, ka. Sometimes she added a color, though garbled. It sounded like red. Each time, adults smiled kindly and brushed her aside. Ramirez began to notice the pattern. During one visit, Emily wandered into the living room, where detectives were questioning Michael. She clutched her stuffed bear, looked up at her father, and then turned to the detectives. "Daddy Carr," she said softly, before retreating to her toys. The words were dismissed, but Ramirez's instincts sharpened. A child's mind might lack logic, but it often clung to memories in simple, unfiltered fragments. Could Emily be pointing them towards something they had overlooked? The idea unsettled Ramirez. He had worked cases where children had provided crucial details, a remembered shirt, a sound, a single word that cracked everything open. But relying on a toddler's words in a murder investigation was risky. In court, it could be torn apart as unreliable. Still, he couldn't ignore the possibility. Meanwhile, Michael's behavior added to the unease. He seemed to grow impatient with the constant presence of law enforcement. "You've searched the house, the car, everything," he snapped one evening. "How much longer will you keep treating me like a suspect?" His words were sharp, though his expression quickly softened when he noticed Emily listening nearby. He scooped her into his arms, pressing a kiss to her forehead, but Ramirez caught the flicker of tension in his jaw. The overlooked witness continued to provide her tiny fragments. Emily played with a toy car, driving it across the floor in jerky motions. "Mama car," she said once, matter of fact, as though stating something obvious. The babysitter froze. "What did you say, honey?" Emily repeated it, then giggled and tipped the car onto its side. The babysitter later recounted it to detectives, her voice shaky. Again, it was written down. Again, it was set aside. Children made associations. Maybe Emily simply connected her missing mother with her father's car because she often saw them together in it. But the pattern was becoming harder to ignore. By the second week, investigators faced mounting pressure. The community demanded answers, the media pushed headlines, and the case file grew thicker with dead-end leads. Ramirez returned to his notes, flipping through pages of observations. One line leapt out at him again and again. Child, car, red car, 3 fragments, all circling the same object. He rubbed his temples, asking himself the question no one else seemed willing to. What if the overlooked witness was the key? Children might not testify with precision, but they observed. They remembered sounds, images, moments. And Emily, too young to understand consequences, had no reason to lie. Her words came raw, unfiltered. That made them dangerous. Still, Ramirez hesitated. Acting on the word of a toddler risked ridicule, especially from seasoned investigators who lived and breathed evidence. But ignoring it might mean discarding the only real lead they had. That night, Ramirez sat in his car outside the Henderson home, staring at the dark outline of the garage. Inside, Emily slept peacefully in her crib, blissfully unaware that her scattered words were scratching at the walls of the secret her father desperately tried to keep buried. And as the detective closed his notebook, he knew one thing for certain. Overlooked or not, the smallest witness in this case might just hold the loudest truth. The Henderson investigation was no longer just a case file. It had become the town's obsession. Every conversation in Maplewood, from checkout lines at the grocery store to late-night talks over fences, circled back to Sarah. Where had she gone? Who was responsible? And why was the investigation stalling? Each day without resolution eroded confidence in the detectives, leaving the community restless and hungry for even the smallest shred of news. Detective Ramirez felt that weight pressing on him as he walked the familiar path up the Henderson driveway. He had been there so many times now that the yellow police tape seemed like part of the landscaping, blending in with the hedges and toys scattered across the lawn. He knew the facts backward and forward, But facts alone weren't solving the case. Something was missing, some overlooked piece that refused to surface. That afternoon, a handful of officers returned to conduct follow-up interviews. A neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, had agreed to bring over some photographs from the night of a neighborhood barbecue, hoping perhaps they contained something useful. Ramirez sat at the kitchen table flipping through images of smiling faces and glowing lanterns, all of which only reminded him of the normalcy that had been shattered. Across the room, Emily sat on the floor with her toys, humming softly. She was rolling a small plastic car back and forth across the carpet, her lips moving as she whispered the same word again and again. Red, red, red. Ramirez looked up briefly. Her voice was faint, almost sing-song, but deliberate. He scribbled another note in his book without drawing attention. He had learned enough to know that if he stared too long or asked directly, the child would clam up or shift to another game. Instead, he listened from a distance. Then Emily stopped rolling the toy and pointed toward the garage door. "Red car," she said louder this time, with toddler certainty, as though reminding herself of a fact adults seemed too slow to grasp. The room went silent for a moment. Mrs. Peterson tilted her head, a frown creasing her face. "She keeps saying that," she remarked quietly. "I've heard her do it before, always pointing at the garage." An officer nearby chuckled lightly. "Kids fixate on stuff. Probably just likes cars." But Ramirez didn't laugh. His pen tapped against the notebook. There it was again, the repetition, the consistency. Children at Emily's age might invent things, but they didn't usually repeat the same phrase week after week, unless it was connected to something real. Later that evening, Ramirez replayed the moment in his mind as he sat in his car, parked just down the street. The words echoed, "Red car, red car." He couldn't ignore it anymore. Sarah was missing. The husband owned a red sedan. And the only other person who had been present that night, too young to understand what she was saying, kept pointing to the very vehicle that had already been searched and dismissed. It was not enough to act yet. The first search of Michael's car had turned up nothing suspicious. But Ramirez knew better than to put blind faith in a single sweep. Cars could hide secrets, and sloppy searches could miss them. He thought about the trunk, the carpets, the subtle details investigators sometimes overlooked under pressure. As the days wore on, Emily's words began to ripple through the small circle of those who had heard them. A babysitter mentioned it to another officer. A neighbor whispered it at church. Soon, red car became another layer of rumor circulating through Maplewood, though most adults dismissed it as toddler chatter. "She's just repeating what she hears her father say," one woman speculated. Others suggested she liked bright colors, maybe she simply liked the word red. But Ramirez knew instinct when it gnawed at him. He had seen hardened criminals undone by offhand remarks from children before. And this child wasn't just babbling nonsense. She was pointing, insisting, threading a story together in the only language she knew. Still, he couldn't lean solely on the word of a toddler. He needed more. He began to revisit Michael's alibi, scrutinizing details that hadn't raised flags before. Michael had claimed he left briefly that night to run an errand, but the timeline was vague. Surveillance cameras from nearby streets showed no clear image of his vehicle. He had no receipt to verify the errand. It was a small gap in his story, one that had seemed inconsequential until now. The breakthrough came during a second canvass of the neighborhood. A retired mechanic who lived 2 houses down recalled seeing Michael's red sedan pull out of the driveway close to midnight on the night Sarah vanished. "I was up late," the man explained. "Couldn't sleep. Saw his taillights heading down the street. Didn't think much of it at the time." It wasn't definitive, but paired with Emily's persistent refrain, the puzzle started to take shape. Ramirez presented the detail to his team. Some rolled their eyes at the mention of Emily's words, cautioning against giving a toddler's chatter too much weight. But Ramirez pushed. She's not inventing this. She's repeating. Always the same words, always pointing at the same car. We'd be fools not to at least take another look. Finally, he got the green light for a deeper forensic sweep of Michael's red sedan. This time, they would not be casual. They would strip it down piece by piece, searching every crevice, every fiber. As the plan formed, Emily sat quietly at her neighbor's kitchen table, scribbling with crayons on a sheet of paper. She drew simple shapes, circles and lines, her tiny hand pressing hard with determination. When she finished, she held up her picture proudly. To an adult's eye, it looked like a messy jumble, but one detail stood out, a large red rectangle with smaller circles beneath it. "Car," she announced, smiling brightly. The neighbor smiled back, praising her artwork, not realizing that once again, Emily had placed the truth right in front of them in the only way she knew how. The smallest detail, the words of a toddler, a crayon drawing, an insistent finger pointing toward the garage, was about to ignite the turning point of the entire investigation. Ramirez didn't know it yet, but Emily had already cracked the case. All he had to do was listen closely enough to believe her. The Henderson case had dragged on for nearly 3 weeks, and the atmosphere in Maplewood was suffocating. Posters with Sarah's smiling face, once fresh and urgent, now fluttered in the wind like fading reminders of despair. Volunteers had thinned out, the media vans remained, and police presence had dwindled to a steady but quieter hum. People were beginning to wonder aloud if Sarah would ever be found, or if she had become another cold case lost in the stacks. Detective Ramirez refused to let that happen. Something about this case had sunk its claws into him. He spent nights staring at notes, replaying every interview, every timeline. Again and again, one detail pulled him back. Emily. The toddler's words weren't evidence in the legal sense, but they haunted him. Red car, daddy car. She had been present. She had seen something. Children didn't lie, not like adults did. They didn't calculate. They didn't conceal. They only repeated. Still, Ramirez knew the uphill battle he faced. Bringing in forensics to comb through the red sedan again, based on a child's fragmented words, would be a tough sell. He needed something stronger, something undeniable. And it came one afternoon in the most unexpected way. Michael Henderson had agreed again to sit down with investigators for a follow-up interview. He was growing visibly tired of their questions, but he maintained the same mask of calm cooperation he'd worn since the beginning. The dining room table had become their makeshift interrogation space. Michael sat across from Ramirez and another detective, answering their questions in measured tones. "I've told you everything I know," he said, rubbing his temples. "I woke up, she was gone. I don't know what else you want from me." "We're just going over the timeline again," Ramirez replied smoothly. "Sometimes details come back with time." Michael sighed, leaning back in his chair. "There's nothing new." At that moment, little Emily wandered into the room. She had been playing quietly in the living room, under a neighbor's watch, but like most toddlers, she preferred to be near her father. She clutched her stuffed bear, padding across the floor in her tiny socks. Her eyes flicked to the detectives, then back to Michael. The room was quiet except for the scratching of a pen. And then, in her clear, high-pitched toddler voice, Emily spoke. "Daddy's car." The words hung in the air, sharp and sudden, cutting through the stale routine of the interview. Ramirez froze, his pen poised mid-stroke. His partner looked up, eyes wide. Michael's expression flickered, so brief, so quick, but Ramirez caught it. A twitch at the corner of his mouth, the tightening of his jaw, the faintest narrowing of his eyes. What did she just say? The second detective asked softly. Emily repeated herself, louder this time, pointing a small finger toward the garage. Daddy's car. Then, as though satisfied, she hugged her bear and shuffled back toward the living room. The silence that followed was deafening. Michael forced a chuckle. "She's a toddler," he said quickly. "She just says random things? You can't take that seriously." But Ramirez wasn't laughing. He leaned forward, locking eyes with Michael. Kids that young don't invent details like that. They repeat what they've seen, what they've heard, what they know. Michael shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Are you really going to take the word of a 2-year-old as evidence? This is ridiculous." "Maybe," Ramirez said, his voice steady, "but she said it before. More than once. Always pointing at the garage. Always about the car." Michael's mask slipped further. His face flushed, and his composure began to crack. "This is absurd," he snapped. "You people are harassing me. I've cooperated with every damn search, every damn question. And now you're hanging your case on a toddler's babble?" But his outburst only confirmed what Ramirez already felt. The walls were closing in. The detectives ended the interview shortly afterward, but Ramirez wasted no time. He called for a new forensic warrant on the red sedan, citing the child's repeated statements and the inconsistencies in Michael's alibi. Forensic specialists arrived within hours, methodically preparing to tear the car apart piece by piece. This time, no corner would be overlooked, no fiber dismissed. Meanwhile, Michael paced the living room, seething. His neighbors watched nervously as he muttered under his breath. Emily, oblivious to the storm she had unleashed, sat on the floor humming to herself, stacking blocks in wobbly towers. The innocence in her world stood in chilling contrast to the gravity of her words. As the team worked, Ramirez stayed close, watching every step. He felt it in his bones. This was the moment. Emily had given them the key. It was only a matter of turning it. Hours later, when a technician lifted the trunk lining and shone a light into the seams, the first trace appeared. A faint stain, nearly invisible to the naked eye, tucked deep in the fabric. Swabs confirmed what Ramirez already suspected. It was blood. Forensics would later prove it matched Sarah Henderson. The room shifted instantly. The murmurs of officers turned sharp, focused. Ramirez's heart pounded. Emily's 2 words had led them here. When confronted with the evidence, Michael's composure finally shattered. He raged, denied, then faltered. The calm mask he had worn for weeks collapsed into fragments. The car that was supposed to be just a vehicle, an ordinary object in a suburban garage, had become the silent witness to his crime. And it was his toddler daughter, with her tiny voice and unshakable repetition, who had forced the world to look closer. For Ramirez, it was a moment that would stay with him forever. Not the satisfaction of catching a criminal, no, that mattered, but the awe of realizing that justice had been cracked open by innocence. All the hours of combing records, chasing dead-end leads, and interrogating witnesses hadn't yielded what Emily had offered freely. The truth, reduced to 2 simple words. Daddy's car. It was the kind of moment that reminded Ramirez why he had chosen this line of work in the first place. Because sometimes, justice doesn't come from science or strategy, it comes from listening, truly listening, even to the voices others dismiss. And in that moment, he knew the case was no longer cold. It was about to ignite. The red sedan sat in the Henderson garage, like a predator, pretending to be harmless. Its glossy surface caught the light from the overhead bulb, and the smell of gasoline and old leather lingered in the air. To a passerby, it was just another family vehicle, unremarkable in a town full of them. But to Detective Ramirez and the forensic team, it was a vault of secrets waiting to be pried open. The first search weeks earlier had been hurried standard procedure. A glance in the trunk, a swab or two, a check under the seats. Nothing glaring had been found, and the car had been cleared. But now, with Emily's words, Daddy's car repeating in Ramirez's ears, they were approaching it differently. This wasn't a casual search. This was war. The forensic van pulled up just after dawn. A chill hung in the October air as technicians unloaded their kits. Black cases filled with swabs, luminol spray, UV flashlights, and portable vacuums. They wore gloves and masks, their movements methodical. Neighbors gathered across the street, whispering in clusters, watching the Henderson driveway with wide, restless eyes. Michael stood nearby, arms folded, jaw clenched. He had little choice but to allow the search. Ramirez had secured a fresh warrant, but his fury was obvious. He paced, muttering curses under his breath, every so often casting dark glances toward the detectives. Emily wasn't present this time. She was at a relative's house, shielded from the scene. Ramirez was grateful for that. The search began with the obvious: seats removed, floor mats lifted, compartments emptied. Dust and crumbs spilled from the crevices. Old Cheerios, a melted crayon, scraps of paper. Nothing unusual at first glance. But the team was patient. One technician sprayed luminol across the trunk and shut off the lights. For a tense moment, the space was bathed in darkness. Then, slowly, faint specks glowed blue beneath the ultraviolet lamp. Not a flood, not an obvious stain, but enough to stir the room. Ramirez's heart quickened. "Hit," the technician muttered. Small but definite. Swabs were taken, bagged, and labeled. They would go to the lab, but Ramirez already suspected what the results would show. Next, the team moved to the carpeting. They peeled back the trunk lining, exposing seams and gaps that rarely saw daylight. It was there, wedged deep into the corner beneath the spare tire, that they found it. A fiber, small but distinct, clinging stubbornly to the rough fabric. Under the microscope, its color and weave were unmistakable. "Matches the description of the sweater Sarah was wearing the night she disappeared," the technician reported. Ramirez's pulse hammered. Piece by piece, the puzzle was aligning exactly as Emily had said. Hours stretched into the afternoon as the sedan was stripped to its bones. Carpet panels were lifted, seat cushions dismantled, wheel wells examined. In the process, they uncovered more. Faint impressions in the trunk lining, like the outline of something heavy that had once been pressed against it. And embedded in the fibers, more microscopic traces of blood, invisible to the naked eye, but undeniable under chemical testing. The technicians spoke little, their silence only amplifying the gravity of what they were uncovering. By the time they finished, the sedan no longer looked like a family car. It looked like a crime scene. Michael, watching from the porch, lost his veneer of calm. He shouted at the detectives, accused them of planting evidence, threatened lawsuits. His voice cracked with desperation, a sharp edge of panic that hadn't been there before. Neighbors gasped as he ranted, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others whispering that they had always suspected him. Ramirez didn't flinch. He had seen this before, the unraveling of a man who realized the truth was clawing its way to the surface. Every denial, every insult, every desperate outburst only tightened the noose. By evening, the evidence bags filled the forensic van. Blood samples, fibers, photographs of impressions, residue swabs, all cataloged and ready for lab analysis. It was more than Ramirez had dared hope for. Enough, at last, to tie Sarah Henderson's disappearance to Michael's red sedan. As the team packed up, Ramirez lingered by the car, staring into the hollowed-out trunk. The smell of chemicals and faint copper tongue of blood clung to the air. He pictured Sarah not as a victim, not as a forensic trace, but as a woman who had once laughed in this very driveway, kissed her daughter goodnight, lived a life that should have stretched far longer. And now, reduced evidence to fibers and stains, her voice silenced except for the echo her daughter had carried forward. It was Emily's 2 words that had forced this discovery. Daddy's car. Without her, the red sedan would have remained an overlooked detail, dismissed as thoroughly searched. Ramirez felt a chill as he realized how close they had come to missing it all. That night, back at his desk, he spread the evidence photos across the table. The glowing blue specks under UV light. The fiber lodged in the trunk scene. The angry scrawl of Michael's face as he yelled from the porch. And in the center of it all, a sticky note he had written in the early days of the case, with Emily's words scribbled in block letters, Daddy's car. Forensic results would take days to finalize, but Ramirez already knew what the outcome would be. And once it came back, Michael Henderson's fragile defense would collapse completely. The car had held its secrets tightly. But thanks to a toddler who refused to forget, those secrets were finally spilling into the light. And the case, once stagnant and despairing, was now barreling toward its reckoning. Michael Henderson had always been a man of appearances. To the neighbors, he was the reliable husband, the father who played in the yard with his little girl, the professional who wore crisp shirts and drove a respectable sedan. But now, in the harsh fluorescent light of the interrogation room, stripped of his suburban backdrop, that image was crumbling fast. Detective Ramirez sat across from him, files stacked high at his elbow. The evidence from the red car lay documented and undeniable, traces of Sarah's blood, fibers that matched the clothing she had been wearing the night she vanished, and faint impressions in the trunk lining suggesting something heavy had been placed there. It was enough to move past suspicion and into certainty. But Ramirez wasn't interested in a mere technical confession. He wanted Michael's mask gone, fully torn away. And for that, patience was key. You've told us this story several times, Ramirez began calmly, opening his notebook. You woke up. Sarah was gone. No sign of struggle. No explanation. Michael leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly, knuckles white. Because that's what happened. I've said it, I'll keep saying it. You don't have anything else. Ramirez slid a photograph across the table. It showed the small reddish stain they had uncovered beneath the carpeted trunk lining. We do, Ramirez said simply. Michael's jaw flexed. Could be anything. Rust, paint, anything. Lab results confirm it's human blood, Ramirez replied. He slid the second sheet forward, a forensic match to Sarah Henderson. Your wife's blood. Michael's eyes darted to the paper, then away. His mouth opened, then closed again. And here, Ramirez continued, unflinching, fibers recovered from the same area of the trunk. They matched the sweater Sarah was last seen wearing. Tell me how that ends up in your car. Michael's composure cracked further. His breathing quickened, his face flushed with a sheen of sweat. I don't know. She could have. Maybe she could have what? Ramirez pressed. Got into the trunk on her own? Bled onto the lining without your knowledge? Think carefully, Michael. Your daughter has been repeating the same words since the night your wife disappeared. Daddy's car. Every time she sees it. Every time she thinks about her mother. You can't talk your way out of this anymore. Michael slammed a hand on the table, his voice breaking. She doesn't know what she's saying. She's a toddler. You're basing this on babble. No, Ramirez cut him off, his voice sharp but steady. We're basing this on evidence. Blood doesn't lie. Fibers don't lie. And neither do children. They only repeat what they see. The silence that followed was heavy. Michael slumped back in his chair, eyes fixed on the wall. For a long moment, it seemed as though he might finally let go of the charade. His lips parted, his throat worked. Then, as though flipping a switch, he straightened and sneered. You'll never prove it. Circumstantial. That's all it is. Ramirez sat back, studying him. He knew the dance. Some suspects broke cleanly, others clawed at denial until the last possible second. But Ramirez also knew the case was tightening like a vice. Outside the interrogation room, reporters circled like vultures. Word of the car's second search had already leaked, and Maplewood buzzed with speculation. Neighbors who had once defended Michael now whispered doubts. The phrase "Daddy's car" spread through the town like wildfire, repeated in hushed voices, on social media threads, in front-page headlines. Everyone knew where it came from. Everyone knew who had said it. Emily. She was too young to understand the role she had played, too young to grasp that her tiny voice had shifted the ground beneath her father's feet. While detectives worked late nights piecing together evidence, Emily played with her crayons, watched cartoons, and asked innocently when her mother was coming home. Her presence, her words, had become the case's heartbeat. For Ramirez, the image of Emily pointing at the garage replayed in his mind constantly. It wasn't just a lead, it was a moral compass. Children didn't scheme, didn't manipulate. They simply told the truth, stripped down to its simplest form. In a way, she had done what the entire investigation couldn't, cut straight through the noise. The following week, prosecutors moved quickly. Michael Henderson was arrested, charged with second-degree murder and evidence tampering. The courtroom was packed at his arraignment, every seat filled with Maplewood residents who wanted to see the man who had fooled them. Some whispered in disbelief. Others glared openly. Michael entered in shackles, his once polished demeanor reduced to a scowl and sagging shoulders. Reporters scribbled frantically, cameras clicked, and the judge's gavel cut through the chatter. As the charges were read, Michael kept his gaze fixed downward. But when the prosecutor mentioned the incriminating repetition from the couple's toddler daughter, his head snapped up, fury flashing across his face. "She's a baby," he shouted suddenly, startling even his defense attorney. "She doesn't know what she's talking about." Gasps rippled through the room. The judge banged the gavel sharply, ordering silence. But the damage was done. In that outburst, Michael had revealed what he feared most, that his own daughter, in her innocence, had become the most damning witness against him. Outside, the town buzzed with renewed energy. For the first time in weeks, there was hope that justice might be served. People stopped to hug Ramirez on the courthouse steps, thanking him for refusing to let the case go cold. And though he accepted their gratitude, he knew the truth. It wasn't him who cracked the case. It was Emily. The walls were closing in on Michael Henderson, and everyone knew it. The evidence was strong. The town's faith was restored. But what lingered most powerfully was the haunting simplicity of the phrase that had unraveled everything. Daddy's car. It was only 2 words. 2 words from a toddler. Yet they had toppled a lie, exposed a killer, and carried the weight of truth, heavier than any courtroom speech could ever deliver. And the story wasn't over yet. The trial was still to come, and the final reckoning would force Maplewood and Emily herself to confront the consequences of what she had revealed. The courthouse in Maplewood had never seen such a crowd. Reporters lined the steps with their cameras angled high. Neighbors clutched steaming cups of coffee as they waited in the morning chill, and every bench inside the courtroom was filled to the brim. The trial of Michael Henderson wasn't just a legal proceeding. It had become the community's collective catharsis, the chance to finally make sense of the nightmare that had gripped their quiet town. For Detective Ramirez, seated just behind the prosecution's table, the air felt electric, almost suffocating. He had spent months chasing shadows, second-guessing every lead, doubting whether the truth would ever rise to the surface. And now, here they were, a jury of 12 ordinary citizens, chosen from among neighbors and strangers alike, tasked with deciding the fate of the man who had once been considered just another suburban husband. The prosecution opened with a meticulous narrative. They painted Sarah Henderson as a devoted mother, a woman with dreams, laughter, and a life cruelly stolen. Piece by piece, they laid out the evidence, the inconsistencies in Michael's alibi, the neighbor who saw his red sedan leaving the driveway that night, and the forensic discoveries buried deep in the car's trunk. But the linchpin, the thread weaving it all together, was smaller and simpler than anyone could have imagined. 2 words, the prosecutor said, stepping toward the jury box. 2 words spoken by the only witness present that night. Not a police officer, not a neighbor, not an adult, but a child. A toddler too young to lie, too young to understand deception, yet old enough to know what she saw. She said, "Daddy's car," over and over. And it was in that car, ladies and gentlemen, that Sarah Henderson's blood was found. It was in that car that fibers from her clothing were discovered. The car is the crime scene. And her own daughter told us where to look. The jury was riveted. Some leaned forward. Others nodded subtly. In the gallery, whispers rippled. Ramirez felt a flicker of pride, not in himself, but in Emily. She had cracked open the case before any adult had the courage to admit what they suspected. Michael's defense team countered with everything they had. They argued that toddlers mimic words, that Emily had overheard adults talking, that her testimony was unreliable. They suggested alternative explanations for the blood, floated scenarios about accidents, and insisted the evidence was circumstantial. Michael sat at their table, dressed neatly in a suit, his hair trimmed, his jaw set. But gone was the easy charm he had once worn like armor. He looked smaller now, hunched, his eyes darting nervously around the room. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for, the testimony of Detective Ramirez. Called to the stand, he recounted the entire arc of the investigation, how Emily's words had first surfaced, how they had been repeated with such consistency, and how those words led to the re-examination of the red car. His voice was steady, factual, but his eyes betrayed the weight of it all. "Did you believe the child knew what she was saying?" the prosecutor asked. "Yes," Ramirez replied firmly. She never wavered. Every time we asked where her mother went, she said the same thing. "Daddy's car." She pointed to it. She repeated it. And it led us to evidence we might have otherwise missed. The courtroom was silent. Even the defense had no immediate objection. Over the course of 2 weeks, the trial unfolded with the rhythm of a slow, inevitable march. Witness after witness chipped away at Michael's alibi. Forensics experts confirmed the blood match. A digital analyst testified about inconsistencies in Michael's phone records that night. Piece by piece, the carefully constructed facade collapsed. On the final day, when the prosecution delivered its closing arguments, the weight in the room was palpable. "This is not just about evidence," the prosecutor said, pacing deliberately. "This is about truth. A man tried to bury it, to hide it, to erase it. But the truth has a way of clawing its way out, even from the mouths of babes. Sarah Henderson cannot speak for herself anymore, but her daughter did. And today, it's your duty to listen." The jury deliberated for less than 5 hours. When they returned, the foreman's voice was clear, unwavering. Guilty. The word crashed through the room, final and irrevocable. Gasps, murmurs, a few tears. Michael Henderson's head dropped into his hands as the judge announced the sentence: life in prison without parole. The man who had once been Maplewood's picture of suburban normalcy was led away in shackles, his downfall complete. For Ramirez, it was a moment of grim satisfaction. Justice had been served, though no verdict could bring Sarah back. He glanced toward the gallery, where Emily sat on a relative's lap, blissfully unaware of the storm her small voice had quelled. She was clutching her stuffed bear, swinging her legs, more interested in the candy she'd been promised for good behavior than in the proceedings unraveling her father's life. And yet, she had been the star witness. She had been the one who, without knowing it, cracked the case wide open. Months later, as the media frenzy faded and Maplewood slowly returned to its quiet routines, people still spoke of it. In diners, in church halls, on playground benches, the story lived on. The toddler who solved the murder. Some told it as a chilling cautionary tale, others as a testament to innocence and truth. But all agreed it was unforgettable. Detective Ramirez never forgot either. Whenever he faced another case that seemed impossible, when the leads ran dry and the evidence felt too thin, he remembered the sound of that tiny voice in a quiet room, Daddy's car. 2 words that had toppled a lie, delivered justice, and reminded him that sometimes the smallest witnesses carry the loudest truths. And Emily? She grew up shielded from much of it. Her family made sure of that. But as she got older, fragments of the story filtered back how her words had mattered, how she had spoken without knowing she was echoing justice itself. She would never remember the case in the way the town did, but her voice had left an indelible mark, one that would live on in Maplewood's history. Because nobody had expected it, not the detectives, not the neighbors, not even the reporters swarming the street. Nobody had expected a toddler to crack the case. But she had. And she did it with 2 words.